Andrew, and the title of the program is Andrew Talks to Awesome People, and that is absolutely true this week. Ken Scott, thank you so much for coming on.
Andrew, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, of course. So I want to just get right to it because there is just so much to talk about that is indeed awesome. So if you don't mind, I think the easiest thing to do is we'll just kind of go through your career. And there's some stuff, I mean, if people don't know anything about your career, then everything we're going to say is new anyway. But I thought that there's some things that are relatively well known, and then there are things that are slightly not as well known. And I want to connect the dots on a couple of things, if that's cool. But we should start with the fact that you started at Abbey Road in 1964, right?
Actually, I started at EMI Recording Studios in 1964, which is what it was back then. It didn't, I'd left by the time it actually became Abbey Road.
Okay, there you go. So
I always have to get that right.
We're 1 minute 19. That's the fastest I've screwed up in one of these. So you came in, and then the typical progression in EMI, and then later Abbey Road, was you started as an assistant engineer. Is that the first position you would get, or you started in the tech shop?
No, started in the tape library.
Tape library. Okay. Do you want to just...
The reason that they did that was so you could learn what went on in the studio, because back then, this was January 1964. Back then, no one knew what went on in studios. And so they wanted the newcomer to learn what a mastering engineer was, although back then we were called cutters, a cutting engineer. Then what you learn the tape library, you learn what happens in the studios, the editors, all of the different areas that were contained in that building. You had to learn. So they thought the best bet is the tape library, where you'd be running around getting tapes from one place to another. So you gradually learn what happened and what all the people did.
Right, and you couldn't do too much damage.
Precisely.
So then what exactly was the progression? So it's tape library, then...
Button pusher.
Button pusher, tape op.
Yeah.
An engineer-ish, right?
Yeah, all we did was push buttons.
Okay.
That's how we got the name. It would be, the engineer would say, okay, record. We'd hit the two buttons. Okay, stop. We'd stop. and that was it. Because back then, even the studio setup wasn't done by the engineer. It was done by the amp room guys, the tech guys. They would put the mics out in basically the where the engineer wanted them placed, and then the engineer would go down and do the final placement. Right. So we did nothing. We just pushed buttons.
All right. And so once you were really good at pushing buttons, where'd you go?
Next was mastering.
Now, I want to talk about mastering for a bit because
that's a touchy subject for me.
Is it? No, I don't want to talk about mastering engineers at all. What I want to talk about is your time in the mastering room at EMI at that point, because unless I've got this wrong, not only were you cutting stuff that was contracted to be cut because of the studios and the label, but you're also cutting American catalog, including Motown at that point, right?
Yes.
So you're getting master tapes from America. No.
We would get the 40. We'd get the 45. We'd double it to tape, and then master it.
Wow.
The problem was customs tapes. They would hold on to for a while.
Right.
First, we could get the singles through quickly.
That's so funny. And would you re-EQ or anything at all, or pretty much flat transfers just back onto the label?
We would always try and cut it as loud as the American one. We never could.
Right.
That was one of the big bones of contention at Abbey Road for us youngsters, if you like, just trying to match the American cutting. We couldn't.
Now, because and I'm probably getting this wrong, but I seem to remember Paul McCartney talking at one point about the low end of the American Motown records, and that's what he was chasing a lot of times in the studio. Yeah. But wasn't he hearing your transferred 45 recut onto the English issue of the 45 at that point anyway?
Oh yes.
So he's hearing it.
You have to remember that a lot of the stuff that they had were the American copies, and if it's louder, you automatically think that there's more of things on it.
Right.
Directly. So it could very well have been that, because initially, coming from Liverpool, the way they heard most of the rock and roll and the music they listened to was sailors bringing it in off the ships, because you couldn't buy many imports, if any import records. in England at that point. So that they, living in Liverpool, which was a huge port at that point, they were getting stuff from sailors, bringing it in.
Right. And just to sort of complete that picture, what was radio at that time? Because, I mean, in the States, radio was always commercial, really. So there were lots of stations and everything getting played, but that was not the case in the UK.
We had three or four stations. I didn't go through them. We had the light program, which was that was the general one for people to listen to. And it's called the light program because that's basically what it had. But that was the only station that would play anything that us kids would like. And that was generally a 1 hour program every Saturday night at 11 o'clock, I think it was, called Pick of the Pops.
Wow.
Then you had the third program, which was, they thought that they were the epitome of class. They would have the Shakespeare on, they'd have opera, they'd have the classical music. Then you had the home service. That was more sort of detective dramas, they'd have dance bands on it, that kind of thing. So that was the middle of the road one. But most of the stuff we listened to was the light program. And most of what we had to listen to was utter crap. We hated it. It wasn't our music at all. But there is an interesting thing that I feel with regard to that what has happened these days so much is that if you're into a certain genre of music, that you tend to only listen to that. So what is happening is that the new up-and-coming acts are regurgitating the old acts doing exactly the same kind of thing. Now, what we heard and what led to a lot of the stuff during the late 60s and early 70s, we were hearing classical, we were hearing dance band, we were hearing all of this kind of stuff. We didn't like it, but somehow it sticks up there. And so at some point, when we're looking for something different, we'll suddenly think of, well, let's try something classical. Hence, yesterday, with McCartney going to it and saying, can we try something like that, which was unheard of up to that point. And we would pick and choose bits and pieces. There's on Moon Age Daydream, a Bowie song. The solo on that comes from the B-side of Alley Oop, which was a big hit. And it was a baritone and a flute. David loved the sound of these two together playing this line. So when it came to the solo, he said, that's what I want to try and emulate. We did it with a baritone and a recorder.
Right.
It gave the same kind of thing. And it's that picking up from other sources, which doesn't happen these days anywhere near as much.
No, but I mean, the UK sort of kept that alive. I mean, because I was going to say until recently, but it's probably been 20 years. But 20 years ago, Radio 1 still had a bizarrely eclectic playlist. Yeah. They kind of, whatever was popular, they were going to play it because they wanted people to listen. It didn't matter about the genre so much. Now, that's not the case at all. But that lasted a lot longer here, I think, than it did other places. Now, just really quickly, so famously, the UK also had pirate radio off of ships, just off the coast, broadcasting. But was that in the early 60s, or was that a little bit later? Was that sort of late?
That was late 60s.
Right. Okay. So at this point, you had radio programs.
Sorry, it changed. So the BBC changed. They realised that they had to try and compete with the pirate radio stations, and so they changed and opened up. I think it was Radio 1. It must have been 68 because George Martin did the call music for it, what was played right from the beginning of the whole shebang. And I remember we were doing the White Album, and when that happened, so that would have been 68.
Wow. Which is, it's only 4 years later, but it's a long time when you consider that's most of the Beatles catalog coming out.
Yes,
that's
precisely.
Incredible. So very famously, you assisted on some Beatles records right away, but I wanted to just briefly talk about the other engineers that were there, because obviously there's the big three working on the Beatles records, which is you, Jeff, and Norman Smith. And then Malcolm Addy was also there when you first came. Did he work on any of the Beatles records, or was he doing other stuff at that point?
He may have done like an overdub when Norman couldn't make it, that kind of thing. He, Pete Vince, they all did a little, but Pete Bound did. But none of them, the old timers, did not like working with the Beatles, because they were used to 10 till 1, 2:30 to 5:30, 7 to 10 sessions, and they'd get home by 11 o'clock at night. Beatles, you could go till 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and they hated that kind of thing, which is why we, complete amateurs at the point, Jeff and myself, were put on them, because we were youngsters. We had no family to get home to. And hey, we were working on the band that gave us the best pool line ever. Hey, I worked with the Beatles. never actually worked for me, but I tried.
Well, it's the fact that you can say it and not be lying is amazing.
Yeah, I know. I think that's the thing. I don't think anyone ever believed it.
So we could spend the next, 45 weeks talking about just the work with the Beatles, but I'd really like to touch on a few of the other artists that you work with. So one, Peter Sellers, who's just, a genius. And so was this on the comedy records that
Yes.
George Martin was doing? Right.
Yeah. My first introduction to that is whilst I was in the tape library. I wore shoes that had leather bottoms. So when I made a lot of noise when I walked. George Martin had obviously noticed that, because there was one point they were doing something. It was when they were doing he was doing covers of Beatles songs, comedic versions of Beatles songs. And there was one bit where they wanted someone walking along going into a church. So he came up, got me, and I had to walk along the corridor clumping my shoes, and they recorded that. So that was my first
that's great
introduction. But then I also got to assist on a couple of sessions, once again, whilst doing primarily covers of Beatles songs. But a very strange man. I think because he played so many different characters, he didn't know who he was, and he would be swapping between characters during conversations.
Right. It
was very, that's what
kind of Robin Williams-ish in that way, I guess.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Huh. Wow, strange. Okay, another one. Now, this is one, it's listed when you read stuff about you, but then when you look for album credits, you don't find your name, which isn't unusual for all of this. But which Pink Floyd sessions did you work on?
Okay, I did the last single with Sid, which was Paint Box and Apples and Oranges.
Wow, yeah, great song.
And then I did I only remember doing one track on the next album, the first one with Gilmour, which was Corporal Clegg. But apparently there is paperwork that shows I did a lot more on that album than just that. But, I don't remember it.
Nothing to do with substances, just
actually, no, it's not. Believe me, it's not.
I just the culture in that studio at that time is really amazing. I mean, there's so many stories. I mean, I know a couple from sort of later, like 70, 71, of the cross-pollination between Pink Floyd and Roy Harper, because they're down the hall, and so they sing on each other's records, and just it's a really amazing collaborative experience being in a multi-room facility. But I would imagine being in that particular facility, especially while the Beatles were there, everybody must have wanted to work with the Beatles or get in the room and say hi or something. So there had to have been an incredible atmosphere of just like everything you were doing was cool.
Yeah, but nobody came by. Very few. I won't say nobody, but very few people came by most of the time. It was working. I think the reason that I got the gig at EMI was within the questioning during my interview. Like the Beatles were my favorite band. It was before they went to the States, like 3 weeks before they went to the States. So they hadn't broken that market yet, but everywhere else they were huge. But something in the midst of the interview, one of the guys interviewing me said, who was your favorite band? And I tell the story that something deep within me, way down there, said, do not say the Beatles. So I said the Dave Clarke Five.
Which is not a bad choice.
Well, they looked at each other and said, well, why the Dave Clarke Five? And once again, I listened to that deep down voice, and it told me to say along the lines of, I'm sure it wasn't quite this way, but I think the addition of the keyboard and the sax gives them a totally different sound from the usual 2 guitar, bass and drum band. Now, the whole point was that they wanted someone that was interested in sound. They didn't want someone that would be trying to take photographs, getting autographs. They They didn't want a fanboy. They wanted someone interested in sound. And I think
Right.
I got the gig.
Oh, that's brilliant. Your deep down voice that's a good voice.
It's kept me going through the last 50 years, believe me.
So one really quick Beatles thing, just in terms of the sort of people they were as they're approaching this absolute gigantic stardom, because as you mentioned, they were about to go to the States. And at that point, it was supernova. But my wife, who's sitting next to me, was saying that they actually played a gig in Worcester, which is not a town that anybody plays. You play Birmingham and then you skip everything around it and go play Bristol.
Yeah.
But they played it in Worcester after they had already exploded because it was booked. And they were like, well, we're going to keep our word and go play a gig.
But they were one of the hardest working bands I've ever come across, because it would be playing gigs in places like that across the country. On their days off, they'd be at EMI recording, then immediately out on the road again. One of the reasons, there are two reasons that the Beatles were as good as they were. One, obviously, is the talent of all four of them. All of them incredible in what they did. But the other one is the work ethic. I think that whole thing of being in Hamburg and playing 3 shows a night, 6 days a week, it made them a really great tight band. And that how many bands would do that these days?
No, it's too much work. You know, you stay home and work on your record in your living room instead.
Well, yeah. And you're lucky if they'll play a gig the day after playing a gig. Normally it's, we've got to have at least 1 or 2 days off. We've got to rest our voices and that kind of thing. But,
yeah, there's a 3 sets.
Yes.
Amazing. All right, we're just gonna skip a lot. If there's anything you want to stop and talk about, please just stop me and say, well, this is an amazing story. So the last one in sort of the EMI days I wanted to ask about was Jeff Beck.
Yes.
Just basically because so we've got playlists from you, inspiration and perspiration playlists, which are just ridiculous, both playlists. There were a couple things I had to take some liberties on because I didn't know like which recording of the 4 seasons. So I put in
it's the melodies that get me.
And really strangely, there is a gorgeous, gorgeous song from Skunk Anansie on that list, Squander. But the studio version of it is not on Spotify, so there must be some sort of licensing thing. But there's a live version that's pretty much that arrangement, and it's pretty stellar. But then also,
I wouldn't know about Spotify because I will not submit to any of those.
Well, good on you. But unfortunately, we'll be sharing a link to Spotify with these. And then the other one, which is actually difficult to find, the studio version of Jeff Beck's A Day in the Life was not on there. The album was there, but that song was not there. So there's a live version of it. But I wanted to we don't even have to talk about that song, but I'm just curious about working with Jeff Beck then.
Well, it was such an amazing band. It was their first album. It was Jeff, it was Rod Stewart on vocals, it was Ronnie Wood on bass, and we had a blast. We had fun. It was great. I felt the one and only time in my life I had to record bagpipes, and I had no idea how the hell to do it. And then, of course,
what'd you use on the bagpipes? I'll ask for one.
No idea. I can't remember. Probably a 67 because I tend to use those on everything. But and then, of course, the story, we had Keith Moon come in and play Timps on Old Man River. And the way the story goes is that we finished around about 11 o'clock at night. And he had a Rolls Royce at the time that had this huge PA system built into it. So, and he had this microphone that he could turn on at any time. So he leaves. I'm at the top of the stairs watching as he's pulling out in his Rolls Royce, this little old lady, because St. John's Wood is very old money and just very sedate. Everyone's in bed by 10 o'clock. She wasn't. She was walking her little dog, and she happened to step in front of the Rolls Royce just as he was about to pull out. He pulls out the mic, turns it on, and starts screaming the most obscene language you can ever imagine. That poor woman, he let it go for about 10 minutes. EMI had more complaints about that than they ever had about having to close down Abbey Road because of all the fans outside, because the Beatles were recording. It was amazing.
Can I have to rewind and restate the sentence that you just dropped in the middle of that. We had Keith Moon come in to play timpani on a Jeff Beck record on which song?
Old Man River.
Old Man River. I mean, those four things in one sentence is insane.
They were great times. What can I say?
God, that's just nuts. So, okay. So you left still EMI at this point in 1969 to move over to Trident, as far as I know. Okay, so
I think it was 69, yeah.
So, but I've got two questions about that. So the first thing is that apparently, and this is, according to the internet, so who the hell knows if it's true, but Gus Dudgeon was one of, or the person who kind of suggested to you that you should do this. I'm wondering why. You hadn't worked with Elton at that point, had you?
No. I worked because Gus was an independent producer, one of the few around at that time, working in different studios. And he at EMI, I worked with him on a band called The Locomotive. We did two singles. One was Rudy's in Love, and I think the other one was Mr. Armageddon. And I had been to Trident because when the Beatles had finished recording Hey Jude, we'd attempted to do it at EMI, but a film crew coming in completely screwed the whole thing. They were booked in at Trident after that to try 8-track. So I went in the last day when they'd done a mix and was absolutely blown away by how amazing it sounded on the system in Trident. So I'd seen the studio, and then I had been fired at the very end of the White Album by the new manager at EMI. I got my gig back at EMI, but I knew the target was on my back and I wanted to leave on my own terms, not be fired again. So I happened to ask Gus, where would you recommend? You've seen most of them. And he said, well, Trident, because the engineer I normally work with, Barry Sheffield, who's one of the owners, wants to move over just to the management side. He wants to give up the engineering. And I'll need someone to work with me there. Went down, met with them and started. But the funny thing was, I never did actually work with Gus until a couple of years later. They put him together with the amazing Robin Jeffrey Cable.
Right.
He did all of the early Elton stuff. And then once he had a car accident, that's when I actually got to start working with Gus.
Right. Now, at that point, was there such a thing as an independent engineer, or was pretty much everybody worked at a studio?
Pretty much. I'm not sure about... I don't know about Glenn, how much he went around.
Yeah, it seems like he worked in more places, but and I could be wrong, but I think he supposedly worked at one place. Because like Phil Brown was the same thing. Like he worked at a place, but he would follow bands around to finish overdubs or whatever. So he'd work in a lot of places, but he was technically staff somewhere. Yeah.
No, so I guess we were all staff.
Yeah. All right. So the Trident era.
Yes.
That's too, huh?
It had its moments.
Well, so Elton John, we've already touched on that. A few records. You came in to finish mixing, right? You see, right at the tail end of one.
Yeah, they had recorded Madman Across the Water. And between the recording and the mixing, Robin had a really bad car accident. And so they obviously couldn't wait for him to get well again. And so I was thrown in the deep end of mixing that, which I did. And it worked out perfectly, really, because after that, Elton wanted a completely different type of record, different sound. He wanted to use the band that he used on the road, Nigel and Dee, and also bring in the guitarist, David Johnston, and do it outside of the country and give a bit more of a, as opposed to the classical pop kind of thing that had been before with the big orchestra with all of Buckmaster's arrangements. He wanted something a bit more rock and roll and pop kind of thing with the band.
Right.
So it was perfect for me doing that. So we did Honky Chateau and Don't Shoot Me, I'm a Piano Player over in France.
Now, there's a great documentary in the classic album series about Honky Chateau. So we don't have to go into too much detail on this, but the workflow on that record, I'd just like you to say if this was really the way the whole record went, but from the way they show it, basically Elton had a stack of Bernie's lyrics. He would pick one out in the morning, figure out, write the song on the piano while everybody's sort of finishing up breakfast. And by the end of the day, that song was basically done, overdubs and all.
Not quite like that.
Right?
But it was all quick, like seeing Rocket Man being written in 10 minutes. And it was exactly that. Bernie would go up early at night to his room to write lyrics. And he'd come down with sheets of paper. He'd give them to Elton whilst Elton was having breakfast. Elton would go, yeah, I like that one. No, I don't like that. Don't like that. Oh, that's not bad. And go through and he'd find some. This one particular morning, he picked up this sheet, which was called Rocket Man. And he went over to the piano, and within 10 minutes, he had the whole song. Just unbelievable. And,
yeah.
But look, remember, back then, all albums were recorded in 2 weeks.
Well, almost all.
Well, I know there was one band in particular that didn't quite do that.
We'll get to Supertramp in a minute, but
I'm sorry?
We'll get to Supertramp in a minute.
Oh, I wasn't thinking them. I was thinking Beatles.
Oh, yeah, well.
Well, yes. Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what's coming.
Well, but we should go from there to Bowie, because that, if you want to just
about the same time, that's the interesting thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, so you started by engineering on a record form, and then was asked to co-produce, right?
Two albums. He recorded the single Space Oddity with Barry Sheffield engineering and Gus producing. And Gus produced it because Tony Visconti hated the song and refused to do it. So Gus produced it. It was a hit. So the record company, Mercury, then said, we want an album. So that was then when Tony came in and I engineered it along with Malcolm Toft, another one of the engineers at Trident. We did that. Then it was a complete flop. But record companies, if they signed talent, they believed in it and they gave him a second chance, do another album. And they started, I can't remember what studio it was. It was another studio, and it was Man Who Sold the World. And then they came to Trident, I did overdubs and then mixed that. Once again, complete and utter flop. And David took some time off. And in the midst of that time off, he came in to attempt to produce a friend of his, a guy called Freddie Beretti, who became one of his top clothes designers. And I had reached that point. I don't know if you've ever reached it when recording an act with a producer sitting by the side of you. You'll come up with a suggestion, a musical suggestion. The way I always tell the story is when you come up to the guitar solo, I turn to the producer and I say, you know what would sound great underneath this solo? And he said, what? I said, a herd of trumpeting elephants. You think so? Yeah, I think it would work perfectly. Bring in the herd of trumpeting elephants, you record them, they go. If it works, it was his idea. If it doesn't work, it's, oh, I didn't think it would work. It's only Ken's idea anyway. But one gets fed up with that after a while and wants to actually be the one that, it's my suggestion, I'll sink or swim from it, by it, whatever. So I'd reached that point, interestingly enough, at the same time as Roy Thomas Baker and Robin Jeffrey Cable had. We all, the three main engineers at Trident, all reached that point at the same time. And so during this recording of Freddie Beretti, David, I was talking with David, and I happened to mention the way I wanted to move more into production, wanted to have more of an artistic say. And he said, well, I just signed a new management deal. I was going to produce an album, my album myself. I don't know if I'm capable of doing it. Will you co-produce with me? Now, my feeling about David at that point was a very talented guy, a very nice guy, but he was never going to be a superstar. And so,
two flops in a row.
Having gone through my first ever assistant engineering job was with the biggest band in the world. My first ever engineering job was with the biggest band in the world. So every fuck up that I made, everyone would hear, kind of thing. It was one of those things. But here's an artist that no one's ever going to hear. So I can actually learn what I'm doing as a producer, and no one's ever going to hear my mistakes. It was perfect until Angie, his wife, and his publisher, Bob Grace, came over to my house one evening, and we were going through songs for Hunky Dory on cassettes. And within about 2 songs, this was totally different from anything he'd done before. And suddenly it was, here I go again. This could be absolutely amazing. I can't fuck up, basically. It's got to be good. And we went into it. I think we were, both of us, with a certain amount of trepidation, because neither of us had really produced properly before. But then as we would try things and things would come together and it was working, just the confidence grew, and it gave us the confidence to try even more, kind of thing. And it worked out quite well. But even that was a flop when it first came out. It took Ziggy, which we recorded about 3 weeks after Hunky Dory, and that broke, and then Hunky Dory took off.
And so were those both 2-week records, basically?
Yes.
And that's including mixing?
There may have been a week also tagged on at the end for mixing.
Right,
So
okay.
3 weeks in all. Now, Ziggy was slightly different. There would be a little tag on for that, because when it was handed into RCA, they didn't hear a single. So we had to go back in and we recorded Starman as a single and put that. We just took Round and Round, the Chuck Berry song, out of it and just stuck Starman in there instead. And suddenly it's a concept album, as everyone seems to think. Yeah.
Well, so speaking of that, because I mean, Bowie's such an enigma as an artist, and he tried everything, basically. I mean, he's got a drum and bass record practically. And so did he have that strong of a concept of who he wanted to be as an artist, or was it just that he knew he wanted to pursue art and he would go wherever it took him? Or was it focused for those 2 records? Because they're pretty...
absolutely. It was focused for three records. The focus started to disappear when we did Pinups.
Right.
But it started before that. The interesting thing was, one of the great things about David, apart from his vocal ability in the studio, the other great thing was finding the right teams to work with to give him what he was after. After we had done Pinups, I did go on to do one other track with him in Trident. And it was supposedly for Diamond Dogs. It was a track called 1994 Stroke Dodo. It was 2 songs put together. And it was one of David only ever came to 2 mixes. That was one of them. And the entire time that we were mixing, he kept on playing. I seem to remember it as being a Barry White record, but it was probably just a Philadelphia sound record. And he kept on saying, I want it to sound more like that. I want it to sound more like that, which is what he eventually did. He just went over there and got the American band together to give him exactly what he was after. He knew what he wanted, without a doubt. He didn't always know how to get there, was the thing. So he would pull the team together and allow the team to do what they do. Complete freedom.
Right.
Once he'd set, this is the direction I want to go in, then it's complete freedom. You do what you want.
So he give you a framework, and then you just go.
Yeah. And for me, like mixing wise, it was the strangest thing ever, because I was used to the whole thing of there'd be me as the engineer, there'd be the producer, there'd be the assistant engineer. At times we'd all be, there would be complete mixes from beginning to end. We'd all be leaning over, pushing up faders, putting them down, changing reverbs, all of that kind of thing during the entire mix. It was a performance. Exactly the same as the musicians. The mixes then were performances. But suddenly, David doesn't come. He gets bored in the studio. There's no way he's ever going to hang around for mixes. Some of the time, I didn't even have an assistant engineer. None of the musicians were there. It was just down to me. So how was I going to be able to do all of this? And I finished up mixing in sections. It's the only way I could get the changes and everything that I wanted. No pun intended. So I'd do the intro, get that right, cut that piece of tape out, put it to one side. I'd then do the first verse, get that the way I wanted it, edit it onto the intro to make sure the edit worked, and gradually built up the mix that way, which was very strange. I kept on doing that for years. Interestingly enough, now in Pro Tools, I've moved back to doing it that way. I like that way of mixing.
Well, because I think that actually became not common practice, but it was done quite a bit later on in the 70s. I know on a lot of the Yes albums, those were mixed in sections, because sometimes they were tracked in sections. And so that piecing it together. Now, when you were doing this, when you're mixing these records on your own, Was there an approval process with him at that point? Because it's not like you're going to do recalls.
No, there wasn't. I finished the album. I'd finished the album, send it into the management. They'd send it into the record company. And I always felt we never even discussed the records. Once they were finished, we never discussed the records. I always just looked at it that if he liked what I did, I'd do the next record with him, which is basically what happened. And the only one that there was a problem on, and it wasn't him, it was management and the record company. The opening track on Aladdin Sane, which to me is the worst mix I've ever done in my life. I now listening to it. The concept of the mix was to make David's vocal like one of the instruments, really mix it in with the instruments. So you listen to it and there's nowhere near enough bloody vocal on it. It's buried. So I've completed the album, sent it to the management. They came back to me a couple of days later and said, Ken, we love the album, but can you just do another mix of Watch That Man? And I said, sure. And as you mentioned, it's a completely fresh mix. You start all over. There's no recall, nothing. You start from ground zero again. And I did one with more vocals, sent it to them. They said, yeah, that's better. No, sorry, they didn't. They said, we prefer the original. That was it. Fine.
Right.
Then it went to the record company. They did exactly the same thing. Called me up, Ken, we love the album, but can you do another mix of Watch That Man? I said, I did one for the management company. They preferred the original. Yeah, but for us, can you do another mix? So I had to go in and do a third mix of it. And exactly the same again. Sent it to them. You know what? We prefer the original. Bang. And that's what's on there. And I hate it.
Wow.
I can't stand to listen to it.
But there's obviously got to be something about it, something the way the track was put together for his voice to be buried in it from the beginning. But I think that was also the thing, is that the now so much of the production is actually happening during the mix that you do need the approval process. Whereas there, I mean, things you're recording with intention at that point.
Oh, absolutely. So, and I still do. I EQ on the way in. I finished up now with most mixes that I do. There is no EQ or anything added. I do it all as I record. The only thing that gets changed, because I can't work like you do. I can't work in the box for love or money. I need the console. I need that, being able to push and play with the faders. That's what it's all about for me. It's that the way I put it. I'm sure you would argue with this.
No, not at all.
That human feel of playing it the whole time. It's like being one of the musicians.
Yeah.
And so that's all I do. I play with the levels, but generally speaking, EQ, compression, all that. Yeah, I have to put some effects on. I put reverb on, bits like that, because I don't record that. But
the tones are the tones.
Yeah.
And you know they work together because you've been hearing them the whole time.
Got it.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. All right. We got so much more to talk about. All right. We can skip Supertramp if you want.
I don't know. I'm at your disposal, Andrew.
Well, I want to get to some other stuff too, but you have to talk about Supertramp a little bit, because I'm sure everyone's going to get really mad if we don't. So you can talk about anything you would like about Supertramp, sort of how it happened. Were you surprised with the success of that record? Just
no. Two things I'll say. First off, one, I turned them down for ages. I didn't believe it, that because of the demos I was sent, they were atrocious. They were bits and pieces of songs, and I never got it. And then finally I saw them and completely turned around. I loved them, and we went in. But I knew that inner voice, I guess it was that inner voice again, told me that this had to be something special. So whereas the 2-week situation, as I mentioned earlier on, we spent a day and a half just getting the drum sound. Now we should have had like 2/3 of the basic tracks done by the time we got the drum sound. So we were going very, very slowly. And towards the end of the 2 weeks, which is when it was supposed to have been finished, get a phone call from A&M telling us that Jerry Moss, the M of A&M, is in town and wants to come and hear the album. No, he can't. We're not there yet. No, forget. Oh, he's the boss. If he wants to come along, he's going to come along. So we played him what we did. And it was my first ever introduction to a record company person coming to the studio. I'd never had to deal with that before. And he came in and we played it to him, and he got up at the end and said, "Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it's very good. I like it." And we thought, that's it. He hated it. It was all up. We expected to come in the next day and get a phone call saying, "Forget it. It's done. You're no longer under contract." Instead, we got the phone call. Jerry loved what he heard. Keep doing what you're doing. You have as much money and time as you want. So we took advantage of it, and it finished up on and off. It took 6 months, but it was on and off. I did another couple of 2-week projects in the middle of that. In fact, one project I think was a week project recording, which was Spectre and Billy Cobham.
Wow! So that was the Billy Cobham record.
I think it was, yeah, if I remember correctly.
Well, he's on my list too, but
so and the other thing with Crime. It was that record that taught me there is no such thing as perfection, because that last night when we completed it, we put it all in its running order, the whole thing. That was the one time we had the opportunity of hearing it the way other people would hear it on the record, just playing it from beginning to end. And the speaker, we mixed it at a studio called Scorpio. And the speakers that they had were Kadak speakers that were 7 foot tall. They weighed half a ton each. They were absolutely unbelievable. Now, I monitor loudly. I like to feel it as well as just hearing it. These speakers, I could never turn them up to full blast. And they were still clean as hell. They were just amazing. So we cranked it. We just sat back, feet up on the board, and had it come over us. And my feeling at that point was I'd achieved my perfection. Now, I could never get as good as that again. And suddenly that made the next projects that I did very, very hard, because I've already done my best. What am I doing now, kind of thing. But then one day I'm driving along and I hear something on the radio. I hear one of the tracks on the radio. Why the hell did I have the drums sounding like that? They should have been much liver. Once I found one mistake, I started to find others. And at that point I realized, hey, my perfection on that day isn't my perfection on another day. And I realized that there is no such thing. You always have to strive for something, because no matter how good you get it on one day, a couple of days later, you're going to start to find faults with it, or a month later, or a year later, you'll start to find faults with it.
Well, and I'm sure like those 3 different mixes of the same Bowie tracks cut with intention were all very different.
Yeah.
You just respond to different things. Things come up in a different order, importance shifts, and and also, how's the pollen count, and did you drink last night? And
absolutely.
Above. Okay, there are 2. God, there's so many things. Okay, so you work with the New Seekers.
I did one thing with them, yes.
Now, the New Seekers, I'm getting this wrong. They're the ones who did "Want to Teach the World to Sing."
Like to teach the world to sing.
Which turned into "I'd Like to Buy the World a Coke."
No, that's the way it started.
It started.
Oh yeah, we recorded the ad. I recorded the ad, and then they took the track, edited it, and copied it to make it the length of a single, and they just recut vocals.
Right. Coke out. Okay, so I had it backwards then. All right. I used that on a pub quiz in the music round the other day. So I just wanted to get that straight. My life has been so ridiculous. It's as I said, the first thing I ever assistant engineer, the biggest band in the world. First thing I ever engineered, biggest band in the world. First thing I ever produced, Hunky Dory. I moved to LA and just happened to rent a house immediately opposite Zappa. We haven't got there yet.
The only ad I ever did became the ad of the 70s and closed down the TV series Mad Men. It was just ridiculous.
I mean, half a century, basically. Absolutely. Huge.
Unbelievable.
Well, okay, so, all right, we can go straight to this other seminal recording, which is Lou Reed, "Walk on the Wild Side."
Mm-hmm.
So you want to talk about that one? Because there've been lots of not full on documentaries, but there are lots of interviews with the bass player, and it was his idea to overlap the electric with the upright. But I'd love to get a better sense of just how that all came together, because it's such an amazing track. But there was obviously a real vision for it before it started. Not at all. Everything about it just happened as. Really?
It was the typical thing of Lou taught Mick Ronson, the song. Ronno then had to teach the musicians. And remember, these are all session guys. Herbie Flowers being on bass, one of the sort of session guys of the decade. He played on more hits than a lot. So we were doing like 2 or 3 basic tracks a day. And we started this one, and it started off, the first thing, the drummer, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he was playing with sticks, and it felt like a march. It felt completely wrong. So I dashed down and said, do you have brushes? And he said, yeah. I said, try those. That worked. So we put it down, and Herb is playing upright bass. We get the I think it was acoustic guitar, or it may have been electric guitar playing rhythm, bass and drums. We got the track, and Herbie comes up to me upstairs, and he says, Ken, can I try putting an electric bass part on it? Like, I think he says it's a 12th above. I said, I'm not producing. Go speak with David. So he mentioned it to David, and he said, yeah, sure, let's just try it. And that's what gave it. But the whole reason that Herbie came up with this is that the £7.50 that they were paid as a session fee back then, if you put on if you doubled, you got paid double. So he only came up with it so that you get paid another £7.50.
That is the best £7.50 anyone ever spent.
You're not kidding.
It's amazing.
Not kidding.
God. All right. So one last one that's slightly a little bit more obscure possibly for other people, but I'm a gigantic Yes fan and also a Rick Wakeman fan. And you worked with Rick while you were at Trident.
Well, from Hunky Dory, yeah, and then I did one track with him from his first solo album, yeah.
Right. Okay.
The Merry Wives of Windsor or whatever it was called, the Six Wives of Henry VIII.
Six Wives of Henry VIII. Yeah. Yeah.
Which could just as easily have been the Merry Wives of Windsor, but
yeah, it probably was, and then they had to change it or something like that. Okay, but also, I mean, we touched on Billy Cobham, but there's another sort of list of things. A really good friend of mine said, you got to ask him about Stanley Clarke. Well, so I'm going to ask you Stanley Clarke. Okay, well, I'm going to go back to get on to Stanley Clarke. Because all right. When I was over in France, I think it was doing Honky Chateau. It could have been Piano Player, I'm not sure. Hey, honey. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks. Sorry, just getting more refreshments. No worries.
So, when we sat down for dinner every night, either Gus or Elton would put on a record whilst we were eating. And the one that they played the most whilst we were eating was this record called In a Mountain Flame by this strange band called Mahavishnu Orchestra. And I would catch snippets of it, and I thought, what the fuck is this rubbish? It's atrocious. It sounds like 5 complete junkies all in different rooms playing whatever because I was only getting snatches of it. And it's not the easiest music to sit down. Even if you sit down and listen to it, it's complex. But then I'm back at Trident mixing Honky Chateau or Piano Player, whichever one it was. And I get a phone call from one of the A&R guys at CBS at the time. And he said, Ken, John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu Orchestra are coming over to England to do a TV show, and they'd very much like to meet with you about doing their next album. And just, I put 2 and 2 together. Hang on, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Elton and Gus loved them. Maybe I should listen to the record properly. So I asked him to send me a copy of it. When I sat down and listened to it at home, just that first time, it absolutely blew me away. Incredible. And so immediately, yes. And so we went on to do Birds of Fire. And from that, it led to this whole other side of my career, which was the more jazz fusion stuff, which led to 4 albums, I think it was, with Cobham, 3 albums with Stan, Dixie Dregs. Yeah. Working with Stan, it was a joy. I've been able to do what I do for 50 years because I've been able to work with the most incredible talents in the world. And it's so easy. I do the same thing every single session. I'm a creature of habit. Do exactly the same. And I don't change anything. It's what happens in the studio that changes. It's the different drum kits, the different players. That's what changes it. And so that whole thing of, I wrote a book a couple of years ago about my career. And as part of it, I went to all of the different members of Mahavishnu and said, why me? Because I was such not the obvious choice. This was a jazz band, kind of, and you expect them to be in a certain way. But none of them could remember why me. So I never found out. But it worked perfectly because they came in with the musician's chops and I came in with the rock and roll background, put the two together, and it worked perfectly. And that's what
I think you hear that on the track you put on your playlist, which is from Birds of Fire.
Yeah.
The second half of it is almost a blues jam, but the first half, it sounds like 70s King Crimson. I mean, it's heavy, odd meter, almost prog, but with different instrumentation. But I don't think a more traditional, whatever that means, engineer for their genre would have brought that out of them. And I think that's one of the most exciting, the power that John gets out of an acoustic guitar rivals anything anybody does on electric. And it takes somebody who hears it that way. I think it's great.
Yes. Well, one of the greatest compliments I've ever been paid, talking to Jeff Beck at one point. And Jeff said, you realize you changed everything. And I said, how do you mean? He said, with Birds of Fire, that just changed everything. Well, fuck me, here's one of the greatest guitarists ever, probably. And he's saying, that's amazing. It just blew me away when I was...
It's the genre hopping, like it's what Miles was chasing, you know, it really went more pop, but I mean, all through Jack Johnson and On the Corner and all that stuff. I mean, that's what he was chasing. And I feel like, I mean, look, I'm a massive Miles Davis fan and I love those records. Yeah. But at the same time, they never sonically went there. They were always cut as jazz records. And I love what you put onto what could have ostensibly just been another jazz record, but it wasn't. It was a new genre.
And it cost the band money because CBS at that point was wholly unionized. So they're supposed to, part of the recording contracts was you have to use one of our engineers.
Right.
And so in using me, at least when we recorded in England at Trident, that was okay. But then when we completed the album at Electric Lady, New York, we would start around about 12, 1 o'clock. A CBS engineer would come in. What time did you finish last night? 1 o'clock. Okay, thanks. I'll see you tomorrow. And he'd go off, and he's getting paid it's part of the recording budget, so it has to be recouped by the band.
Oh God!
Just for him turning up at the beginning of the session, finding out what time we finished the night before, and they're having to pay him the entire time. So it cost them to use me, but I think it paid off for them.
Now, were those records, because I mean, I think especially when you see them live, they're obviously an amazing band and play like that. But were those records cut live like a jazz record, or were they put together more like a? Okay, so they were cut live.
Mahavishnu was cut live. With Stan, I think the first album, a lot of it was pretty live. But as we went on, we did a bit more. Like one of the things I used to do with Stan, which he didn't quite get the first time I showed him it, but then got into it. He'd have these ridiculously fast runs, and doing it on bass, he would hit it perfectly, but it just became blurred. So what I had him do, we'd then go back, I'd turn the tape down to half speed, I'd have him play it again perfectly in time with the other one. We take it back up to normal speed, and there it is. You can hear every note, and it's played perfectly. And so there'd be those kind of things we'd do. And some of it was overdubbed. One of the worst sessions for me was on School Days. The one thing I always wanted was Cobham and Clarke together.
Right.
Oh God, I wanted it so badly. Then it happened. And it weren't what I expected. They were trying to outplay each other the entire time, and we'd do a take, and it was just ridiculously. They were playing amazingly, but you couldn't tell what was going on. So they'd come in. Oh no! I said, guys, look, just tone it down. You could both get to show your things. They'd go back in and they'd overplay again. And finally, after a few takes, they got it and calmed down. And then we got an incredible take. But the other thing with that album, sorry, just one other quick thing with that. This was at the time of quad, just as quad, 4-speaker quad was being pushed. Now, one of the things I was asked by A&M if I would do a quad mix of Crime of the Century. And I said, yeah, sure, I'd love to. And they said, well, how long would it take you? I said, it'd probably take 2.5 weeks. And they said, oh, we've got a guy that would do it in 2 afternoons. Now, that's the way quad was being looked at by the majors at that point.
Well,
it never took off. But what we said, we went to Atlantic and we said, look, no one's actually recorded something specifically for quad. Can we do it on this album? They said, what a great idea. Oh, yes, please. So we did. Everything was done specifically so that we could mix it in quad. We did the quad mix. We're about to master. I get a phone call from Atlantic. Ken, we want to put the stereo out first. But we haven't done stereo mixes. We only did the quad because that's what we'd agreed. Oh, I'm sure you can find a way around it. So we just put the back together with the front, and that's what you hear. Luckily,
so it worked. And that was that.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, though, with the two of them in the room, do you think it was just the excitement of playing together, or were they competing?
Competing. Most definitely competing.
Just showing off to each other.
Yeah, of course. Well, the band that I work with, there's that side of it. They both knew what they could do and what the other person could do, but it was trying to top each other. With a band I worked with, the Dixie Dregs, I'd been approached about working with them, heard their first album. I thought I could actually bring something to it, so we agreed. They came to LA, and we were in SIR, Studio Instrument Rentals, for pre-production. And I said, okay, play me a song, play me a tune. And I sat down. About halfway through it, I just got up, went over and stopped them, and I laid into the drummer. It was, look, this part you just done, you don't play all over the place. All you do is boom, boom, cha, boom, 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 cha. He said, you've got to be fucking kidding. I said, no, that's what you do there. And I slowly but surely got him to simplify almost everything he did. And he hated me. He wanted me dead. He eventually understood, because these were basically young kids out of Miami University. And they wanted to show off what they could do the entire time. And it took a couple of numbers, but he eventually understood it's the overall thing you're interested in. You all get your own time to show off. You can't all do it at the same time. And he got that. And now he says, you gave me a career. Thank you. I could never have kept I could never have got as far as I did playing the way I did there. But
that's awesome.
He hated me for that time.
Well, it's a sign of a good producer who's not afraid to have the drummer hate you, I think.
Right.
So, all right, you just took us to LA. So let's talk about that. Okay. So you moved there in 76?
Yes.
And you immediately were living across the street from the Zappas, is that right? At the top of Laurel Canyon?
Yeah, that's the way it went. The first of all the places we could possibly go to in LA, we happened to rent a house. I dropped the family off to have the gas turned on, the electric and all of that, whilst I went to A&M to finish off some mixes that I was doing. Came back at like 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and there were no lights on or anything. I went over, and of course this is before cell phones and all that. I go over and I'm banging on the door and no one's answering. I get back in my car and I'm sitting there and I'm starting to get really pissed. And then eventually there's a knock on the car window, and I turn around, there was my eldest daughter, and she's with this other girl. Wind the window down. Yes. Hey, Daddy, do you know someone called Frank Zappa? Yeah, why? Oh, this is his daughter Moon Unit. He lives just over there. We're hanging out there. Do you want to come over? Of all the places, it happened to be just across the street from the Zappas.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's a nice part of the world too, because I a Synclavier tech back in the day, so I got to go up there and I worked in the studio a few times, and it's just an amazing place. But yeah, and the kids were always there,
Yeah.
hanging around. So,
Yeah.
but you never actually worked with Frank, did you?
No.
No,
not at all. We would hang out a little, but we were both workaholics, so it was tough. There would be occasional times. It was more the families that got together than Frank and I.
Right. But Gail, Mrs. Zappa, was the way into one of my favorite things on your discography, actually.
Oh.
So do you want to, you just tell the story, because I'm sure it's going to be better in your mouth.
We'd eventually found the house that we bought, which was about 5 minutes away from Frank's, just down the road, basically. And one Saturday afternoon, before that, I'd gone to see Frank play at Poly Pavilion at the UCLA. And he got a new drummer with him, a kid called Terry Bozzio, that I was absolutely blown away with and thought he was incredible. And backstage afterwards, telling Frank how much I loved the new drummer and all of that. Cut a few months later, and a Saturday afternoon, I get a phone call from Gail, his Frank's wife, and she says Terry Bozzio and his wife Dale and one of Frank's guitarists, Warren Cucurullo, have just come up here. They're forming a band together, and Frank thought you might you might be interested in it. Can they come down and play you some stuff? So they came down, and they had a boombox with them that they played these demos on, and they were shit. It was terrible. But it's that inner voice, always that inner voice. There was something, and I can only assume it's because I'd seen what Bozzio was capable of that pushed me. Well, let me hear you play live. Well, we're only rehearsing at the moment. I said, okay, let me come down to rehearsal. Went down there, and I could see how could work with it, and we worked with it a bit, and then we went into Frank's studio, brand new studio, to record 5 songs. The reason we went into Frank's studio, he let us have it for nothing, because it had just been built. He knew my reputation for finding every bloody fault that was possible to find in a studio. He wanted to come off the road and go straight into record. So get me in there, find everything that's wrong, get it fixed. That'll be perfect for when he comes back. So we got the studio for free for a couple of weeks to record these songs. We had lots of downtime. That's why it was a couple of weeks. But he came back to a really good working studio, and we got some great recordings out of it. And everyone was, then we tried to shop a deal for them. They eventually became known as Missing Persons. The original name was US Drag, but we changed that to Missing Persons. And we tried shopping them probably 2 or 3 times throughout LA, got turned down everywhere. We tried England, we tried Australia, we couldn't get them a deal. So we put out our own 4-song 45 EP, 7-inch EP. And it just so happened that one of the tracks on it became the most requested record of the year on K-Rock, KROQ, which was the up-and-coming radio station in LA at the time. Yeah. And it got us a record deal. And we went on to sell 800,000 units on the first album.
And that's what, 85, 86, something like that?
I'd say 84.
84.
83, 84, yeah, something like that, I think.
That's so. You got to the name of the band, so Missing Persons. Everybody who's watching this, if you don't know the band Missing Persons, you need to. And also, if you don't know Warren Cucurullo, he's the best line in Catholic Girls because of the way she says his name. Warren Cucurullo. It's amazing. So the Zappa song.
But be very careful if you do a Google on Warren. He did go through a spell where he had his own pornography, I think it was, a video site on the internet. And he would do interviews with the public whilst he was in the shower washing himself. And it just, and he blames me for all of that. You see, one of the things, well, Dale, before she became married to Terry, she did Penthouse, she did Playboy. And I should mention, I eventually became the band's manager because we couldn't even find a manager that would look after the band. So I was the engineer, producer, and manager of the band. we were talking, and we knew that press would eventually pick up on Dale and the Penthouse and Playboy thing. So we tried to figure out a way around it so that would kind of make it funny. And so what we decided to do was, so Dale did Penthouse. We got Warren to do the centerfold for Playgirl. And then Terry did Architectural Digest. So it gave us the perfect thing. Now, the fact he had so much fun doing the Playgirl centerfold, he blames me for everything that carried on afterwards.
Wow. All right. I think we can leave that one right there.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And if you want to know anything about him, go watch the early videos with Dale, who's basically wearing saran wrap for the first video. Not much else going on there. But
also look very carefully, because there are many attributes that she brought to the whole thing that has been copied almost perfectly by Lady Gaga.
Absolutely. I mean, as a front woman, she amazing. But also the way you put the records together sonically. I mean, I don't think there's ever not a doubled vocal, right? I mean, she's never sort of on her own. It's lots of layering, even with the lead vocal.
No, she's on her own.
Well, not that anyone else is singing with her, but I'm just talking like.
We didn't double.
Oh, really? So
if I remember correctly, there were doubles. Yeah, of course, at certain point. I won't say renowned for, but I tend to very much the verses will be single and the choruses will always be doubled.
I was doing stuff today, and I must have only listened to choruses then, because I was trying to remember. Because I mean, I listened to it a lot back when I was in college in the late '80s, but it's been that long since I listened. And I love the production and the style of the record, because it's not that much like a lot of the other stuff you've done, but it's perfect for that band and it holds up. A lot of stuff, even with those same sort of effects and things, could sound dated now. And those albums, absolutely.
That's the interesting thing I find about most of my work. I don't think we've ever really gone for the sound du jour. We don't use the latest synth sound or the latest Phil Collins drum sound or anything like that. It's just a regular drum kit, getting the best sound we can out of it. It's just a regular bass guitar. There might be a couple of little bits, but most of the time it's just natural. That's the kind of sound I go for, and so it never really goes out of date.
But I think there's some engineers who, I mean, Al Schmidt is a perfect example of someone who's a completely natural engineer.
Yes.
But really, he's capturing what's there, whereas you're still creating sounds. I mean, the sound of the drums on the Missing Persons record, it's not just an acoustic kit in a room. Like, there's a real thing to it. And I think maybe to you hear it as being natural, but to me, I almost hear you're making up a sound because that's what the song's supposed to be. Like, the band has a really strong sonic personality to me.
Okay.
And part of it, Terry, and I mean, there's a lot to it.
Terry is the most musical drummer I've ever worked with. The way he uses a drum kit, especially, you've seen his drum kit today, have you?
Not recently, no.
Oh, he has two sets of toms. One set is chromatically tuned, the other one is diatonically tuned. He uses like about five or six bass drums. He has several snare drums. Cymbals like everything you wouldn't believe. He doesn't use it with any other musicians. It's just for solo performances, and it's amazing. He plays music on the drums. He's taken it from just being a rhythmic instrument to being a musical instrument. But that's how we would play the drums with the cymbals at certain because he co-wrote every one of the songs. He knew exactly what he wanted to do and where to put emphasis on certain words, certain beats. He was using rototoms at the time, so that would give a different tom sound. And I also, with him, I did my trick of having the bass drum mic mounted in the bass drum with both heads on. So that gives a different bass drum sound.
And that's a closed front head.
Yes.
Right.
Completely. Yeah.
Right. So the cable going in through the air hole, and
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I know we want to get to some questions and things too, but so real quickly, the Tubes.
Oh, what a joy that was. As well as learning more about drugs than I ever wished to know, because they used to do all their dealing in the vocal booth, and so we'd have a mic. We'd just bring a mic up and listen to what was going on in there. But no, it was a joy. It was a strange album because even though I treat each song on an album as its own entity, there are going to be things that hang together within all of the tracks. Ziggy, one of the things that is virtually constant on it is the acoustic guitar on every track. Even if it's a rock and roll track, there is acoustic guitars, which is basically taking I didn't like cymbals at the time, so I think I'd mix them down, and I think the acoustic guitar sort of took that range of where the cymbals would have been. So that's there all the time. But with the Tubes, number one, there are three different vocalists. Every song is just, you go for a totally different character for that, from Slip My Disco, which is a total disco song, to there's an old, we tried to do the Jordanaires and an old Elvis song. Then there's Don't Touch Me There, which we went all out for Spectre. We even used Jack Nietzsche to do the orchestral arrangement to get more of the Spectre feel and everything. So that was amazing, just not having to worry about going from one track to the next. Everything was going to be different.
But of course, I mean, that's how you learn too. Like, I get questions all the time about how do you keep albums consistent and things. And I just pointed all the Beatles records you made. Every song is totally different. They've got 4 lead singers in the band because Ringo was going to sing one.
Yeah.
You know, it's a record because you say it's a record, and it only doesn't hang together if it's not good.
Right. Yeah.
So it's brilliant.
If it's in the grooves, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I know that's a dated thing, saying in the grooves, but that can also be taken musically as a groove. If it's there, it's going to happen.
I mean, there's some Yes songs, just talking about doing the mixes in pieces and tracking in pieces. There are Yes songs which from section to section sound like completely different records, but it doesn't matter. And as soon as you've heard it twice, you expect it and you like it, and it's what you enjoy about it because it's done well.
Well, that's why Happiness Is a Warm Gun is one of the songs that I picked. It's because of that, the 3 completely separate sections. Although it was all recorded in one, as such, we didn't do a separate section then edit them together. That was all one. Then the overdubs were kind of more separated. But it's that was the first time I can think of trying to get completely different feels and sounds for each section, the 3 different sections, and it worked for me.
And no one's telling you can't, so you do.
Well, that was why they were the greatest thing for me, is that learning as an engineer, because the first time I sat aboard with them, I had no idea what I was doing. I never engineered anything before. I knew that I knew how to turn a knob and push a fader up and down. What they did, I had no idea. And there I am with the biggest band in the world. And that first session was a write-off. But because of the relationship, I always say that our job is 75% personality driven. It's how you get on with people. If they like you, if they trust you. If they don't trust you, they're going to be looking over your shoulder the entire time. And that's the worst experience in the world. So I think as an assistant engineer, I built up enough of a relationship with them that even though the first session, it was iffy, they would trust me to go on further, and it worked out.
Yeah, it kind of did.
Thank God.
Well, I was going to ask you about Devo, if you want. We could end this little tour with Devo, because I thought that's a good place to stop that, and then we can talk a little bit about what you're doing now, and then we got to get some questions in too, if you've got time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here.
Great.
I'll just get more and more drunk. Don't worry.
Perfect.
You'll get the real story then. Devo, yes. I was first told about them by an assistant engineer that I worked with at a place called Chateau Recorders in North Hollywood. which I used for a couple of years exclusively, basically. And he told me about them. I thought, you got to be fucking joking. That sounds awful. He played me their first record. I thought, that's atrocious. It's horrible. I can't stand it. The Brian Eno one. And then they played Saturday Night Live. That completely turned me around. And suddenly it was, I get it. Yes, I want. And then shortly after that, they came to me, would you produce? I went up to San Francisco, saw them play live, and I definitely wanted to do it. Now, I'm sure you know that sometimes the first meeting with an act, where you're trying to sort of find out where you stand, where they stand, and all of that kind of thing, it can be a little touchy.
Yeah.
Well, it just so happened my ex-wife, there's a reason she's my ex-wife, was there at this. It was a breakfast meeting the day after, morning after they played the gig. And it was this first meeting, and it got a little touchy, and she got very defensive on my part. And she laid into them. No, shut up. So it worked out okay, but I met with their manager, and he said, yeah, they want to work with you. They do have one question. I said, yeah, what's that? He said, your wife doesn't come to sessions, does she? I said, no, don't worry.
Wow.
Yes, but no, working with them, as with the Tubes, very, very professional at what they do. Until someone walks into the studio, then they take on their persona.
Right.
They go mad. And at one point during the Devo album, the management of the studio asked if they could show someone round that wanted to possibly use it after we'd finished. I said, sure. And as this guy walked in, Mark Mothersbaugh started to run around the studio screaming at the top of his voice. As soon as the guy walked out, then it was back, okay, now I'll play the part properly. That kind of thing. And it was very much the same with the Tubes. They would go into personalities if someone came in. Otherwise, they were themselves and totally professional musicians and incredible musicians. Spooner was great. Prairie Prince on drums was amazing. They were so good. Mike Cotton on synth and Vince Welnick, just all of them. They were great.
I wanted to just point this out because I think it a lot. You've just said it. I think sometimes it's really, really important to see a band live because early recordings, you may not get from them what they think they are. And if you ask a band to describe themselves, you get a different description from every single person in the band. They'll think, we're an R&B rock thing. Oh no, we're a deep metal prog thing. But we see them live and that crystallizes everything about what's important, what the energy is going to come from. Is the rhythm a big deal? Is the singer the star? I mean, all of that stuff. And you get it in one song on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah.
You know who that is. Elvis Costello on Saturday Night Live, just to talk about another performance where if you thought Elvis was a little bit of a troubadour songwriter, you realize, oh, no, he's a punk who happens to write more lyrics than punks do.
Yeah,
so
no, that's right.
Important point. All right. I think unless there's anything you wanted to go back and touch on, I think, do you want to just talk about what you're doing now? Because you're up, you're teaching, right, at Leeds Beckett University.
Kind of, sort of.
Adjunct.
I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds, at a university up here called Leeds Beckett University. Now it's the I've got to remember, we changed the name just recently. It's Leeds School of Arts, I think it is. But the way I learned being in a studio and just watching great engineers work and picking up from there, and then eventually getting to try it myself and find out what I'm doing, that's not there anymore. Now it has to come from schools, universities, that kind of thing. And so the way I look at my gig at Leeds Beckett is I'm there to try and teach the next generation that are learning what it used to be like, how it used to be fun. These days it's sitting in front of a damn computer. And I'll look at people in the university working and they're not having fun. It's not like it used to be. And it's try and tell them the way I work and the way I've always worked and the way it was back then, the good things about back then. I love technology. I love the technology we have today. There are things we can do today that we could never dream of doing back in the day. But I feel that we have allowed technology to take us over. If we have 100 plugins, we have to use 100 plugins, or at least 99 plugins, on every single goddamn track. No, we don't. I'm a firm believer that everything on a good record happens in the studio, not in the control room. It starts off with a great song. And a great song is one that sounds just as good just with an acoustic guitar and vocal as it does with the full production. Then it's down to the performance. And now I've been blessed. I've worked with probably the best studio performer ever. That's Bowie. I co-produced 4 albums with him, and 95% of the vocals on those albums were first take, beginning to end, not changing a thing.
Wow.
I would play the tape, get the level and the sound, go back to the beginning, hit record. What he did that one time through is what you still hear today. So it's a pretty high standard for me. These days, for me, it's more, I'll do 7 complete tapes, and it always has to be complete, because I think that's the only way you can get a performance. If you do it bit by bit, it's not a performance.
Right.
So I do 7, and then I disappear on my own, and I will put the final vocal together. But it happens in the studio. The sound happens from the studio. I started 4-track, so we had to combine things together, and the EQ we had was minimal. So we had to get the sound in the studio, go with that, and that's what we had to live with. And that's still the way I work today. So I look at what I try and teach the students. Don't be afraid to make a decision. You don't have to leave 12 guitar solos up to the mix engineer to decide what's best. It's a fucking guitar solo. Just decide what works.
Oh, and especially when that guitar solo is recorded across 6 tracks with a DI.
Oh, of course, yes. Yeah. And it's the kind of thing we touched briefly on the fact I don't have to EQ much now because I do it all in. It's like if I'm recording a guitar and I'll use a room mic on that guitar just to place it slightly differently in a mix. I don't keep the room mic and the amp mic separate. I mix them together the way I want them. I make the decision then and there. There's nothing wrong with it. It's do that and save time later. And you know what you're aiming towards when you do that.
Yeah, and there's no perfect way to do anything. So whatever you do is you make it work because that's what's there. And I think when I've been teaching, I sort of there's an analogy which is not very well thought out, but it's this idea of what are you building on? So if you build on things that can change, you're building on sand, and you don't know that the stuff you're doing now is going to work with what that's going to turn into. Yes. So the more you do on the way in, and if you record it to separate tracks, it's fine. But the people who record their guitars, let's say every microphone's separate, they do a balance as they're recording. That balance never, ever changes. So you might as well be on one track. Then shape everything else around it, and it gets you to the finish line. But it also makes things coherent. And especially when you get to the point where someone's got to sing a complete take of a song. What are they singing to? They got to sing to the song, and that better not change later. So
and the whole thing of it being a song, probably the hardest project I've ever done was with an English band called Level 42. The reason it was so hard, we didn't have any songs going in. They would go down to the studio, they would groove, come up and hear it. Okay, that groove works. Now let's write a song around that. I never knew what the song was going to be, so I never knew what direction to take, what things should sound like, where it should go, the whole thing. And it was really hard for me.
Right.
I need to have an idea of where we're heading. That's why I don't understand the modern thing, which you're a part of, and all power to you being part of that. It's having that separate mixing engineer.
You can't pin this on me, man.
No, I'm not. No. you do it, and you do it very well. I don't understand how you can do it as well as you do it.
It's really difficult, to be honest. It really is. And especially like even with bands that I love and they have a big discography, so there is a known entity. It's really, really difficult to get recordings, hear something in your head, and be able to get it there, because of course what you hear in your head is a feeling. It's not a sonic thing.
Yeah.
The tracks aren't necessary. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, it's very, very different. Different. There's another thing that I think I've noticed going to talk at a lot of different schools and meeting with the recording students, is that while they're at a school, you would think like, oh, great, that gets them out of their bedroom and they're in rooms with other people, but they still don't collaborate. I was at the Leeds College of Music, which I'm assuming is right around the corner from where you are, and very talented people, amazing,
absolutely.
Great, but they've got this sort of common room cafeteria lounge type thing, which is the first floor of the building. And there were probably 100 students in there, and every single one of them is wearing headphones, working on a laptop. None of them are saying, hey, check this out. And the way I would do these little master classes in the morning is each person would play their stuff. We'd listen to 5 minutes of it, and I'd just give them some feedback. And it was the first time they'd played anything for anybody. And I think, and you can do that completely online. You don't have to get in a room with that. But I think for the younger engineers starting out, to collaborate, just to say, hey, what do you think? And someone will say, ooh, why don't we put a herd of elephants on this? And they say, well, how do you record a herd of elephants? And say, well, Ken Scott puts a 67 on everything. So put up get the elephants, do it, and that will inspire you and get you moving again.
The thing is, do you mic the elephants up individually, or do you just use a stereo pair?
No, section mics. Section mics. You can't trust them. You cannot trust them.
No, I know. But yeah, right. But what's interesting, number one, I try as much as possible to do classes by doing a master class, bringing a band in, because I've been doing the same thing for 50 years. I do things just automatically. I don't even realize I'm doing them. So when I'm talking to the students, I'll miss a lot of what I do because I don't even realize I'm doing it. Whereas if they're watching what I'm doing, then, well, why did you suddenly go and do that? Now I have to think about why I did it. Now I can tell them. And at one point, I have quite a few of the records that I did, the multi-tracks on Pro Tools. And at one point, I brought up something, I can't remember what it was. And I just turned to one of the students and said, okay, come over and mix it. He was paranoid. He was absolutely terrified. He didn't know what to do. They'd never sat in front of the board and pushed things up. And it was very interesting watching it.
I think it's great. And it's also, because I've noticed, I actually attended a workshop that Al Schmidt did about big band recording. And being in the room and watching someone do stuff, because I would watch Al and he'd do something. And then I remember a couple of times afterwards, I'd say, Al, so look, when you were doing this, like, I think I would figure out his thought process, and it would turn out I hadn't at all, but I'd sort of deciphered what he's doing back into my own thought process. So I think the more experienced you are, the more you can get out of watching other people work too. It's just because you'll hear something, think like, oh, right, how are they going to deal with that? It's definitely not right yet. Then you watch them deal with it, but then intellectually, that's not the way they were hearing it at all. But you still get to a place where it works. So I love the fact that you're doing that. And one of the tracks on your playlist, your Perspiration playlist, is by Mackenzie Lee Meyer. And that's a track you did during one of your master classes.
Absolutely. I did it at a university up in Canada. And it's on there because to me, it was an early master class that I did. I've done several more since then. But it shows that the talent is out there, and it's none of it is auto-tuned. There's no moving around, all that. It's her performance. It's the musicians' performances, who are all students at the university, and it stands up for me. It stands up with a lot of other records out there, and the talent is there. Unfortunately, we appear to be, at least with major labels, it's very much, we're going to make an act. It's very much like it was before the Beatles. It's very singles oriented. And it's very, we'll make the artist, we'll make them look right, we'll make them sound right. It doesn't matter if they're not singing on the track. Well, these days they are singing on the track. We just auto-tune it to make it sound like they can sing, that kind of thing. And it's going to turn around. I totally believe in talent. I think that band, like the Beatles, is going to come along. It will be nothing like the Beatles, but an act is going to come along and change everything. And suddenly it will be, the record business will be back where it needs to be.
And if it's anything like it was then, I mean, I was lucky enough to work on a couple Neil Diamond records, and he was a brill building writer. So he would write a song. He'd show up in this building in New York where all the publishers are, and he'd play the song for all the publishers. Then he'd go home, write some more songs, show up the next day. And he said overnight, every independent songwriter was out of work. Because everybody wanted bands that wrote their own songs. When the Beatles broke, that was it. The model was done. And that's the only reason he became an artist. Because it was either singing your own songs or you're done. Because nobody wanted writers anymore. And so that kind of sea change can happen. I mean, I don't know if it can happen quite that seismically now because of the splintering, but it can absolutely happen.
Oh, yeah. But that particular time in England was so phenomenal. That could never happen. The talent that came out of this small island after the war, that there was something that triggered the artistry, from songwriters to players to singers to producers to engineers. There's a group of us, all of the same age, round about the same age, that just changed everything. And it's all from this small island at the same time. Unbelievable.
It's, I mean, because I've always been a huge fan of British music. British rock is my favorite music. Like, that's it. And it's this weird filter that other music goes through. Because I mean, a lot of the bands, especially like the Beatles, would always talk about the American influence and what they were listening to. And a lot of English bands say, well, we were listening to American this and whatever. But it's the filter it comes through is so different. And it goes to the sonics of how the records end up sounding, all of it. But it is this really incredible powerhouse.
There's that weird thing of the grass is always greener. At one point, the Beatles would have done anything to have sounded like a Motown band. Just that sound that they used to get in Motown. They would have killed to get that. But at their height, we got, back then it was a telex, from a Motown saying how much they loved the Beatles sound and how they would kill to get the same sound as the Beatles.
There you go.
Grass is always greener.
The grass is
Can you
always.
move to a question?
Yeah. Let's get some questions going. So, Mark, you want to come in and do some stuff, and then we'll wrap this up. But this has been awesome. Thank you so much again, Ken.
Oh, my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. This is amazing.
Especially at the moment. There's nowhere else I can go.
People are having a ball. Okay. I'm going to start with the number one question here from John Martin. Do you have any favorite or notable memory of working with David Bowie in the studio that you haven't already covered?
The most memorable for me is the vocals. I've never worked with an artist quite like that. He was just absolutely astounding. But like second under that, it's things like recording Life on Mars, recording Aladdin Sane. Just it goes along with his being able to find musicians that would give him what he wanted. And Rick Wakeman was perfect for giving him what he wanted for Life on Mars. And Mike Garson was perfect for giving him what he wanted on Aladdin Sane and on Time. And he could pick musicians. And my whole thing has just been working with great musicians. I do what I do very quickly, put my feet up on the board and just have this music wafting over me. It's fucking amazing. Best drug in the world is sitting there listening to great musicians just play.
Amazing. Okay, I like this one a lot. David Pickney asks, do you have any advice if you were to work with the 1960s Beatles today? And I think another way to put that would be, do you have any advice for your younger self if you were back in that position, knowing what you know now?
No. Look, the way my life has gone, I wouldn't second guess maybe I wouldn't have married the
Did
first one.
okay.
But apart from that, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so Jose Orozco asks, how is the vocal for Hey Jude recorded? Huge fan and much respect, Ken.
I didn't do it. It was done at Trident. I only went there for the mix. I would guess it would have been 67s because that's what they had quite a few of at Trident. And just to put one rumor to rest for the people actually watching this, it was John Lennon that threw off the headphones saying, fucking hell, about 2/3 of the way through the song. Because it's been said that it was McCartney because he played something wrong on the piano. That whole thing. It was the headphones. Apparently, the headphones were too loud, so John threw them off, and he cursed and sweared, and they never pulled it out. It's played ever since.
Issue resolved. Nice. Okay. Next question. We'll just fly through these quickly here. This one's from Matt Vienna, and he asks, which mic's on Elton John's piano?
I believe, because I think I was only using 2 mics at the time. So it would have been probably a KM56 or a 54 on the high end and a 67 on the low end. Now I started to have phase problems, discovering phase problems. So I started to put a 3rd mic in the middle, another 67 up the middle. And I used that just enough to get rid of the any phase problems between the 2 mics.
Amazing.
And were all the Elton John albums cut on a grand, or would he go back and forth to an upright if the song called for it? Or
we never, well, on the ones that I did, we never had an upright. So
right.
Okay, here's another great one. This is from Charles Emile Bioden. He asks, what did you learn from all of those great artists that help you get better yourself?
Oh God, I learned something from every one of them, I hope. Because it's all about learning and improving. It's always striving to do better. I guess the best answer to that really is from that beginning of working, having the ability to experiment. I was working with the one band in the world at the time that they had all the money in the world, they had no time problems in the world, and they never wanted the instrument to sound the same way twice, which gave me carte blanche to try any mic in any position with any EQ. I always felt that the freedom I felt was that I could completely fuck something up. And there'd be as much chance of the guys coming up and saying, oh God, that sounds like shit, as there was of them coming up and saying, oh God, that sounds like shit, but I like it, we'll use it. And that really frees you up. McCartney wanted to use a different mic on something, and I've no idea what it was. So he and I went into the mic room where they store all the mics. And I was looking for a mic that I thought would sound good on whatever the instrument was. Mm-hmm. He just turns around and says, oh, I like the look of that one up there. Let's use that. He was more interested in what it looked like rather than what it sounded like. And that's amazing freedom for someone trying to learn their gig. And something I say to the students all the time, one of the most annoying things is walking down the corridors. There are several rooms at Leeds Beckett, and you'll walk down the corridor and you'll find them empty. And I know myself and several of the other professors, we try and ram home to them, look, experiment here because it's free. Once you leave this place and go out there, the studio costs money. You're not going to be able to experiment and find out what works best for you. Do it now as much as you possibly can. And hopefully that rings true to some of them, but not very often, unfortunately.
Right.
Different times.
Yeah.
Okay. For this question's for both of you. Drum compression then versus now. How has the approach changed for you? And this is from Alejandro Alvarez.
Who wants to go first?
You.
Okay. I never compress drums. The only drums I've ever compressed are Ringo's, and that's to give a very specific sound. Otherwise, no, I don't compress them, limit them, do anything. The only compression that they will get is I will usually have a minuscule amount of bus compression on the final mix. And that's the only time drums will ever see a limiter or a compressor. Andrew?
Well, I'm known for destroying things. I mean, so when recording drums, I will usually have a couple of extra microphones, one of them being the talkback mic and one of them being some mono mic somewhere that I will crush for effect. The rest of the mics are untouched. They're EQ'd maybe, but it's a mic in the right place if you're lucky enough to have a good drummer with a good drum kit. So I think recording-wise, they're not too dissimilar, other than I probably put up more mics than you, and I like to have these extra ones just in case.
Sure.
But mixing, up until very recently, I had lots and lots and lots of parallel compressors that I would mix and match and use on drums to do stuff. But I'm actually, this album I'm mixing right now, I'm barely using any of it. And I'm actually, the what you described for your setup is, I don't even have a bus compressor on there. There's a limiter at the end of the chain just to catch the peaks. But I've ended up pulling all the compressors out. And I am using a compressor on the overheads to get a little bit more excitement out of the cymbals, just because they're rather dark, and otherwise all I get is this ping off the ride all the way to the song kind of thing. But that's it. So I mean, I'm known for compressing the hell out of everything, but I always do it parallel, and I'm using less and less of it all the time. So who knows? That could happen. But yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Is that an answer?
Cool. Okay. So what would you tell someone who's pursuing to get that Abbey Road EMI Beatles sound to go on? That's from Joaquin Bischoff. So what would you tell someone who's trying to get that kind of sound today? What are some things?
Use a red desk, use a Fairchild 660 limiter, use an Altec, I can't remember what the thing is that's modified by Abbey Road. For the drums, Slack, T-tails across every one of them, Fairchild 660 across the drum kit, heavily compressed. Probably vocals would also be Fairchild 660, overused like mad to point of distortion. That's it.
Yeah, just go to Abbey Road.
And a lot of
no, you couldn't even do it there these days.
Right.
British Grove, you might be able to, because they have a red desk there. You were going to say something, Andrew?
Oh, I was just saying, in a lot of U47s as well, and 67s. But yeah, and you got to get the Beatles in front of the microphone. I mean, that's yeah. But I think there is something to take from that, though, is, you know, talking about Ringo's drum kit, how treated the drums themselves were, and the way he played. It's intentional for the song. It's not, I'm going to go out there and bash. It's how hard should I be playing the hi-hat on this song to balance the kit? How dead should the toms be? Because that way, with minimal microphones, you're picking up a picture of what's out there as opposed to having to construct it.
Well, the other interesting thing, I said much earlier that our EQ at that point was very limited. As an example, there are a number of tracks on the White Album. The Beatles went through this thing where they would come in when we're going to do a mix, and their first words were, put full bass and full treble on every track. Pardon? Put full bass and full treble on every track. So that's what we did. We went to 10 on both the highs and lows, and they still sound okay. With today's EQ, you couldn't do that. But the amount, the type of EQ and the amount there was on those red desks, and just the way those red desks were, it's amazing.
And look, there's plenty of documentation, which I'm sure is, you know, it's not all going to be 100% accurate. But I saw Jerry Hammock is in this chat here, who's written a few books about making those records, and there's also the Recording the Beatles book. So there's tons of documentation, and you need to be a student of this stuff. You really do. You don't have to recreate it, but if there's a record you like, 30 years ago, you couldn't find out anything about it. You would read the liner notes, which were better than they are now, but that was it. Now, There's going to be somebody on YouTube who is working on the record who'll talk about it. There are books. You've got a book out there. There's so much information. So you really need to go to a student.
But it's the problem is when it's correct information.
Yeah, but even if
you've got to be very, very careful about judging that kind of thing. And one of the things that drives me mad is the only way to get a good bass drum sound is you have to use this piece of gear.
Yes, well,
bullshit. Don't believe it. It's the only way to get a good bass drum sound is to have a good bass drum.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and preferably John Bonham and Keith Moon playing it.
Yeah,
that'd. Yeah, there's no definitive anything, but it is easy to be a student of the history, even if it's slightly incorrect on details and things like that. And look, we don't even have to talk about the plugins that are emulations of hardware and what we think about whatever, but the fact that you can play with a 7-day or a 30-day demo with something that's kind of like the Presence EQ that you were just talking about, go play with it. Yeah. The Red Deck. It's been modeled, and whether or not
it's quite good.
Yeah, and so that'll give you the flavor of it, and that's the whole point. It's the flavor, because you're going to have a different source anyway. So if you just want to get a feel for the workflow, also limit yourself to 4 tracks and go make a record.
Oh, that's what I say. Every student should start for the first 3 months. They should only work on 4-track.
I got to work with Spoon lately, and one of my favorite things they've ever done is they did an EP called the Soft Effects EP, and the first song about that is called Mountain to Sound, and it's on 4-track, and it is fucking gigantic. It's one of the coolest sounding things that they've ever done, and they've done a lot of really cool sounding things. So as an exercise, it will make you make decisions and listen a lot harder than you will if you're just trying to capture stuff. All right, anyway, sorry.
Awesome.
Next question.
Well, I have a question that's kind of along the lines of what we were talking about a second ago. So this one's from Rob, and he says, another question, is there a fretless guitar on the White album? John had a fretless Honer. There's proof in an interview where he plays the fretless guitar.
We're talking about the guitar that was recently on Antiques Roadshow, which has been valued at a very, very high price. I happen to know the guy that owns that.
Oh.
And no, there is not. It's not, to the best of my recollection. I have to throw that in. I seriously don't believe that there is a fretless guitar, 6-string guitar on the White Album. But there are certainly pictures of George with that particular guitar around. And there are other things going along with that. But I think the main track that it's been stated that it was probably used on was Helter Skelter. And what they think is the fretless on that is not. Definitely not.
Awesome. Oh, let's see here.
Can I just, I want to admit that in college, I actually pulled all the frets off of a PV guitar just to see what it would be like. And I'm not a good guitar, well, I'm not a guitar player at all, but that's not going to be in tune.
It has to be used very sparingly.
Yeah.
Just very quickly on that, thinking back to Missing Persons, the bass player, Patrick O'Hearn, that was in the band, we were recording one of the tracks for the album, and initially we tried with a synth bass, Moog synth bass. It didn't feel quite right. So Pat then said, okay, let me try fretless. So he put fretless on it. Still didn't, it just wasn't quite doing it. So then some brainiac came up with the idea, well, try playing the 2 tracks together, the synth and the fretless. I said, you've got to be kidding. That's never going to work. We played it and they were perfect. That shows some musicianship.
Did he get an extra $750 for doing that?
I think session fees have gone up a bit since then.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, this one's from Voidsloth. That's a great name. I hope that that's a band name. Any general tips or techniques for getting vintage type old school tones without having vintage gear? Just looking for ways to inspire vintage vibes aside from the instruments themselves. Thanks.
I can't come up with anything.
I mean, I think you could use high pass and low pass filters to just inspire you a little bit instead of trying to get a full picture, like make things mid-rangey and see what happens. But yeah, I don't know. Because I mean, like you were talking about before, you feel like you've been doing the exact same thing for 50 years. You weren't doing a vintage thing back then, and you're doing a modern thing right now. You capture what you hear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of us kind of feel that way. And sometimes I hear stuff that I did on a Mackie analog 8 bus that, holy shit, how did I do that? And I'm sitting in front of a Neve. You know, it's just your ears, I think, more than anything. But again, be a student, go read some books about people making records back then and try and set up something about that working environment that's the same.
Yeah. You mentioned towels on the drums.
Sorry. One of the other things along with that is not using many mics.
Yeah.
There was none of that back then.
Yeah.
No, I heard that Bonham used to get upset if there were, I mean, 2 mics was it, but when Glenn was using 3, he's like, okay, but any more than 3, he was not happy because you're mess with his performance.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There are 2 drummers I wish I'd worked with. He was one of them. Gene Krupa was the other. But,
that's a good pair.
Yeah. That's interesting pair.
I've got to say,
the drummers that I've worked with have all been so amazing.
Yeah, you worked with a couple.
Oh, yeah.
Couple.
Yeah. A couple or 100.
Okay, yeah. So to that end, what's the #1 factor that you find in a band that makes you want to go excitedly on board and work on them or with them?
That inner voice. That's it every time. With the missing persons thing, especially when I moved to the management side, I was turning down production gigs to concentrate on managing the band, and all of the people around me were saying, "You've got to be nuts. You're insane." No one got it except that inner voice until one day there was a small gig in LA that they played, and both my wife at the time, my assistant at the time, and my business manager at the time, they were all there. And that one gig, they all came up to me and said, "You're right." And it's going with that inner voice every time.
You should rent out your inner voice. Just give people advice.
Absolutely.
Here, Waves is making a plug-in of it.
Try modeling it. You'll have a hard time.
Okay, so how are you guys doing? What do you think? One more, a couple more? Or?
Let's take it up to the 2-hour mark.
Yeah. Okay.
7 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So
if that's okay with you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Oh,
perfect. Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So Bo Billstrup asks, can you mention that you wouldn't give into the streaming? How do you see the future of how we get music and how to make it better? And maybe we could just change it around to like, where do you see the industry going, or what do you think, based on your experience and how you've seen it morph so many times, what do you think we're in for?
As I said earlier, the way I see it is that there is eventually going to be an act that will come along that will change everything, much like the Beatles did. And it happened. I happened to watch a BBC documentary about Sinatra, a 4-part documentary about him, watching it yesterday, and how he had to change when Presley came along, and how he hated Presley, and how that affected music. And then the same kind of thing when the Beatles came along. And I think the same thing's going to happen again. It's just, when it's going to happen, I've no idea. I doubt that it will be in my lifetime, unfortunately, but because I'd love to see what it is. As far as how we need artists, the big artists that unfortunately are making a lot of money from streaming, we need them to stand up and be counted, because the small acts aren't making a fucking penny or a couple of pennies out of streaming. It is completely unfair, and it's the major labels. They do their separate deals with the streamers. They get paid no matter what.
Yeah.
And they could give two shits about what happens to the artists. We've had Taylor Swift stood up to be counted for a brief period in time, as far as I'm concerned, until she got a better deal. Then suddenly she backed down. Adele, from what I understand, first 3 months of one of her albums, she wouldn't allow it to be streamed, and it became the biggest selling album of the year. We need more big artists to do that kind of thing, because it's not the way the record company say. People will buy product. They will buy CDs. Yeah, they will buy vinyl if that's the only way they can get the music they want. And that's why I will not go on Spotify. I will not. I pay for Amazon Prime. I could get music through that, but I won't even go there just because I disagree with that whole way of doing business. And I won't be hypocritical enough to actually listen through a system that I don't agree with. So it's very hard for me to find good music these days. But so it's where it will go. I don't know. There are the two things that I see. One that needs to happen, and we also need to start teaching young kids from like 3 or 4 years old what music can and should sound like, because all they're being taught is that music is supposed to sound the way it does with earbuds and, God forbid, beats and through a computer. It's not. That's not the way music should be listened to. It's far more moving than that. We need to start teaching them at a very early age. No, you're not listening to music on that. So,
but at the same time, I mean, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, when you're growing up and there are 3 radio stations and it's AM broadcast, that's mono and it's band limited, but it was also the exposure to all of the great music of the time.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think people listening outside their genre is really important. Curators are always important, and that's what radio is supposed to be, but it isn't. There no independent radio anymore.
No.
So it's difficult, but that is what it takes. It takes music as art as opposed to music as commerce, and separating those is a very difficult thing to do. Yeah,
we're very much back at the commerce side of it, unfortunately. But you can have both, as has been proved by many artists. You can have both. And the record companies have to sign for talent, not for anything else, and believe in that talent. Much like if you sign a band or an act and their first album doesn't sell, then you do another one if you believe in them.
Look, if Bowie started now and had 2 flops, he's done. He's not self-financed.
He wouldn't have 2 flops. He'd only have 1.
Yeah, only the one. Yeah. Only the one. And on that really depressing note, I think we've got 2 hours. Ken, thank you so much. That was awesome. So much that I didn't know, and it's that's the work with Sid Barrett, going all the way back to that. I mean, just incredible, absolutely incredible. And,
well, I could tell you the story about the one session that I remember of working with him, but we don't have. We'll have to do another one, and I can tell the story then.
All right. We'll do a part 2. We'll do a part 2 and start with Sid.
You got it. Andrew,
right.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all you do for our industry and Puremix. What you're doing these days, it's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Yeah, and on behalf of everybody, I wanted to say thank you so much for doing this for us and spending 2 hours of your day to come on and talk to us and all of that. And obviously, Andrew, as well. It's such an amazing thing for us to be able to talk with both of you in this format, and just epic. So thank you very much. Much appreciated.
And thank you to all of the people out there that have spent their 2 hours watching us.
Yes, exactly.
Awesome.
Because otherwise, what's the point?
Right. It's great. Well, guys, thank you. That was so much fun. And we'll be back tomorrow, everybody, in the chat room. Thank you for watching. And all right.
All right. Thanks, Ken.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks, Ken.